Another interview with David Carpin, which is coming up in a moment. We're going to talk about 15-minute cities or 20-minute neighborhoods. And David is talking about this as he wants to stand for the Reform Party. He'll be the candidate for Henley for the next general election. He will also stand in the local election, the Oxford local elections, whenever they happen. And he is extremely concerned with this 15-minute city idea. And Oxford has been used as a test base for this. We talk about what the scheme is, which is Oxford will be divided up into zones, areas. And if you travel outside that area in your car and don't have permission, you'll be fined £70. You will get permits to give you permission to travel outside so many times a year. And if you don't get that permission, you will be fined. It is all against the motorist. It is an attack on the motorist, and it's driven by the green agenda, by zero emissions, carbon neutral, whatever you want to call it. That's how it's driven. And the people in Oxford seem to be against it. Oxford Council don't seem to be concerned about that. They're pushing ahead anyway. And this is a test case. And obviously the push is for this to be rolled out across the country. So David will discuss this, why he is standing with reform and why we need to oppose this creeping control coming across our cities in the UK. Enjoy the interview. And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thank you for joining us on another interview. And we are over back to UK side, looking at UK issues and UK politics. And it is absolute delight to be joined by David Carpin. David, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on Hearts of Oak.
Great to have you on. And the link I put under David is Reform Party UK. We'll touch on that. But Dave, do you want to introduce yourself, and then that connects with that tagline underneath your name?
Yeah, so I'm the Reform candidate for Henley, Oxfordshire. And within Oxford itself, there is some politics going on, which will not just impact the people of Oxford, but potentially different countries all over the world. And that's really what we want to discuss today.
This is a worldwide issue, you're right. And Oxford has been used as a testing ground. And we've titled this the Oxford Experiment with 15-minute cities. And at the moment, I think Oxfordshire County Council, which is Labour, but that's no bad or good thing any longer in UK politics, and backed by everyone else there, the Lib Dems and I think the Greens. They want to divide Oxford into 6 areas, which are called, I think, 15-minute districts. And this wouldn't be believable if it was not true. And I think when I first came across this with Oxford Council proposing it, I don't know when it was, sometime last, could have been middle of last year, I thought it was some kind of spoof, but it is not. David, do you want to just let us know, because this is your neck of the woods, this is your area, what exactly is being proposed by Oxford Council?
So Oxford Council are planning to split Oxford City into 6 of these 15 to 20 minute regions. So the theory is that you should be able to travel from your home 15 to 20 minutes and have all amenities available to you: schools, hospitals, food, shopping, whatever you need. And that is 15 to 20 minutes by bike or walking. So what's happening in practice is that the cars, there's a constraint of travel, or this will be the plan for 2024. There'll be a constraint of travel whereby somebody who lives within Oxford who wants to go from one zone to another can only do that 100 times in the space of a year. And if you're a 2-car family, that effectively means a husband and wife only have 50 opportunities to travel. So you can imagine if you're going from zone A to zone B, you're going and your school is in a different zone, or your work is in a different zone, you could start racking up fines very quickly, or you'd have to take different routes around the city, use the ring road, which would be a much longer journey, more expensive, more time consuming, potentially more pollution as well.
It sounds like it's simply going to mean that the ring road around Oxford, where I was, I think December, meeting up with someone there, and it means the ring road is going to be utterly congested. I mean, you're going to have an M25 around Oxford basically to cope with this.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? That if Oxford has a congestion problem, all you're doing is moving it to the next street along. And if you block that street off, you move it to the next street along again. So the ring road will be chock-a-block full of traffic, and people's journey times will be longer, and the costs of travel will be much greater.
I mean, it's obviously cities are congested. Oxford is congested, as is where I am here in West London. But it seems a strange venture to simply, in effect, make it legal to travel 15 minutes away. That doesn't seem to be the best solution.
Well, you would have thought better solutions would be to improve the infrastructure within the city itself, particularly bus journeys. And but another problem that Oxford specifically has is it's coning off a lot of these streets, so it's not possible to physically travel down them. They're putting bollards up, and there is a big backlash against this. I mean, some of these have been removed forcibly in order that people can move around the city.
To tell us about that, because again, those outside the UK may not understand the madness of low traffic neighborhoods. And I remember getting stuck. I remember going for a haircut and spending 50 minutes trying to get out of where I was because I literally could not vacate the area I was in. But explain to the viewers who may not be UK based what on earth it is.
So you can imagine streets of terrace houses. Lots of cities and lots of towns within the UK have these rows of terrace houses, and they were built in Victorian or Edwardian times pre-car. But there are streets which are big enough to accommodate cars, and then of course cars need to park outside each of these terrace houses. So the problem that Oxford has is by cordoning off these streets, you can be traveling down a street and you just hit a whole load of bollards, you're stuck, you have to do a U-turn, and you have to find your way out. It's not a straightforward process.
And it's not simply blocking off the roads, but it's cameras that take your picture. So, I mean, explain that.
And this is the reason that the plan to really roll this out properly is 2024, because a lot of the cameras have been installed. All of the infrastructure is being installed this year to make sure that everybody can, in effect, be fined for going to the wrong part of town from next year forward. And part of the technology is already in place. It's been rolled out further.
And I've seen it here in London, but there's a cost as well. It's not as if it's free to put a network of cameras up across a city. There is a cost to it.
There's a cost, and that is been foot by the government. So the government has said to Canterbury and to Oxford that we want you to trial this, and these are two willing participants. So what's interesting about this is if you go back to the basics of your fundamental rights and freedoms, your inalienable rights, your right to travel, your right to go to work, these are being constrained not just by the Greens and Labour Party and Lib Dems in local government, but it's effectively being sponsored by a Tory government.
That is a big issue, because I think many of us who are perceived or see ourselves on the right of politics would happily point the finger at Labour, Liberal Democrats, Greens, but it's an interesting concept whenever it is a government which in theory is centre right is actually pushing this agenda.
This government hasn't been centre right for a very long time. The only thing you could say of them is they haven't gone completely woke. But if you consider any concept of welfare socialism, immigration, so last year, for instance, rightly or wrongly, this country took in 1 million immigrants. Now, there can't be many Tory voters thinking that that's a good idea. So the moral of the story is that the Tory government has their own agenda, which is quite different from the agenda of their own party membership.
We'll get on the politics side in a little bit and talk about reform. But if we can stick to what is happening, because Oxford it's a very well-known city because of the university there. It's known throughout the world, but it's not a massive city as such, isn't it?
No, it really isn't a big city, but because it is a university town, it has a certain politic associated with it. And not just the students, but the lecturers as well, and everybody associated uh, with that university city. So Oxfordshire, of course, itself, outside the city, has plenty of smaller villages, plenty of greenery, and a different type of demographic and a different type of politic associated with it. But in some ways, Oxford is the perfect place to trial something like this, not from a practical perspective. I mean, practically it's absurd, but from a political perspective, the right people are there to try and implement it.
And you touched on the beginning, but this basically means that if you live in your zone, and this all sounds like a dystopian movie, but if you live in your zone, then actually you need to request permission to drive outside that zone. And if you don't ask permission and that permission is granted like a child, then you'll be punished.
That's absolutely the case. So, what sort of country do you think that we're living in whereby you have to ask somebody permission to leave your front door to go from A to B, and that somebody's actually going to measure how far you travel, where you go, how you travel by car or otherwise, and ultimately you will be punished by way of fines for going to the wrong place too often. So this is a big scope creep, because if you start off with the idea of living in Oxford and that one family can essentially do 100 journeys, we know that if this were ever successfully implemented, that number of journeys would be reduced. And if you're traveling from outside Oxford into Oxford, it's only 25 journeys that you can do.
Wow. Stay away from Oxford. I used to love Oxford. I used to love driving in and going around. But it affects many things. It affects for instance, if you apply for a school and you can't get into schools, and there are massive pressures on our education system because of unlimited immigration. But if you want to get your closest school, and in the UK we put down 6 choices, if you
Mhm.
end up in choice 6 and that ends up being 15 and a half minutes walk away from where you are, then actually there's no way that you could drop the kids off on the way to work, that you then have to change schools in effect.
Well, there's a couple of problems there, aren't there? So the first thing is you could go to the end of your boundary and ask your children to walk the next 800 yards. And the other option is exemptions. And the problem with exemptions, well, who gets an exemption? Does the mother travelling, taking her kids to school get the exemption? Do the councillors themselves get the exemption? So it's open to abuse in every way, shape and form.
I could see this as a black market scheme. You're right. David, you need to get on the council because you can make a lot of money in selling these permits to the public.
Exactly.
But you're right. It opens up to again, if you have a mum dropping the kids off and she is pregnant and doesn't want to wait in the rain, and it is much easier, much more conducive, then she'll have to think, well, I've maybe nearly used up my allocation this year. Do I want to pay a £70 fine? And £70 is a lot for most members of the public.
It certainly is, and you can imagine that again. More wealthy people might even be able to tolerate it and just pay the tickets as they do in central London, just park up anywhere. But for most people, it's going to be completely out of the question. And you could rack up those £70 fines very, very quickly. And how do you know that you're going to get one? There'll have to be a call centre. People phone up, say, right, I've moved from A to B. Am I going to have to pay a fine on this one? So the whole infrastructure is a little bit more complicated than we might imagine, and it's simply impractical.
And
And
of course,
ultimately, it can only really work if everyone gets rid of cars, and everybody voluntarily says, right, that's it. We will do this. We will get bicycles, and we will walk, or we will ride our bikes the 15-20 minutes. But then, of course, the practicalities are, you've got issues there, because how do you take your kids to school on a bike? Or are you going to walk it all the time? Or will the school be within your zone?
well, I mean,
And will they stop the fines at cars? And ultimately, with the scope creep, it will just continue to constrain travel of any variety.
well, it will. And I I know if I was living in Oxford and in that situation, it could be difficult because we have two children go to different school. Then you work in a third area, so you've got three drop offs in effect, and many people will be in that situation where they are punished for simply making sure their children get to school and making sure they get to work.
And schools, hospitals, there are people that need to make frequent visit to hospitals, and some of those people might come from outside of town and only have the 25 opportunities to go into the city. So again, do they need to apply for exemptions? How is it going to work? Will they be expected to rack up fines? And hospitals are interesting cases anyway, because there's never enough parking. They tend to charge you for the parking, and then on top of that parking fee and the cost of getting there, you've potentially got the fines as well.
This is just to look at it from a wider angle. This is not just a UK issue. I think the 15-minute city idea, or 20-minute neighborhood, however you want to call it, was born from C40, which is a network of mayors worldwide, chaired by City Can, which the mayor of London, the awful mayor of London, the socialist mayor of London. But this is, I wonder whether the world, and I think there was an issue in France, but I wonder whether these mayors are basically using Oxford as a petri dish to trial out this experiment.
Yeah, so it's part of Agenda 2030 from the United Nations,
Yeah.
and the World Economic Forum have stepped up to suggest that they can help implement this. So, for instance, the SDIS 21, which is Sustainable Development Impact Summit, is a World Economic Forum summit that took place last year in 2021. And they mentioned that as well as Oxford, Canterbury, it's been rolled out. They're looking at Birmingham in the UK, and they're already working with Melbourne, Australia, and they're already working with Paris, France. So I would imagine there'll be other cities and towns as well, all around the world. So the idea is to roll this out much further. They'll try different test beds. India is another place. Things are often tried in India because if you manage to lock India down, because they've got such a big wealth divide and such a big population, and with people, as you can imagine, some of them even sleeping on pavements, to actually corral all of the people into getting the same thing done is very difficult thing to do. So India is often a test bed for this type of activity as well.
Where it seems to be driven hard on the left, and it does seem to be the green agenda taking inspiration, I guess, from the illiberal days of lockdown. That seems to be a boon to them to push this forward.
Yeah, that's right. So going back to the Sustainable Development Impact Summit, the World Economic Forum summit that took place in 2021, I listened. It was chaired by a chap called Kallol Ratti of MIT, and they had a number of people from Australia, India, and the UK. But I just picked out some of the buzzwords from it. And as you rightly say, that the pandemic was an opportunity to promote equality, to drive social outcomes and social change. Is about the environment and health, and about the community. It's about the quality of access and the quality of opportunity to reduce social inequality. It's about the climate emergency. We're going to build back better, and it's about marginalised communities, diversity and equity. Now, you could say I've taken all of those words out of context, but the reality is there is no context. This is just virtue signalling. And for you and me, we might not fully be emotionally engaged with this type of language, but the left are. And that's the point, really. This is absolutely driven by Green Party, Labour Party, left-wing ideology. It's all pie in the sky, sort of socialist Marxist ideology.
No, it is. And when you say climate emergency, I'm more concerned of the legacy of lockdown emergency, the destruction that's done. And climate emergency doesn't, even whether, and I don't accept it, and I think you're exactly the same, David, don't accept the man-made climate change argument. But even if you did partially accept that. Surely the destruction of lockdown to families, businesses, and lives, that has to be a short-term priority, but yet that seems to be completely ignored.
It's ignored, and this ideology will move us forward to climate lockdowns. And there's been a big pushback in Oxford about this, and that surprises me, I've got to say, because British people haven't really pushed back on much in the last 20 years. But if you look at the Oxford County Council website, questions like this have come up. You know, is this just a climate lockdown? And the council have had to come back and answer a lot of very difficult questions. I think that there is so much pushback that it might be enough to stop them moving forward with it.
Well, I want to get into the public pushback, and I know you've been involved in that. And but I was reading about this. I think it was back in November, and that could have been me the first time. I think it was the Times actually brought this story to public attention, and made it a I guess expose this issue to the public at large. And I know there was a public consultation. The problem is that if you've got members of the cabinet who are saying that it's going to happen, and it's definitely going to happen, and that's in the middle of a consultation period, it shows that actually the council are ready to disregard the views of the public, which shows that the democratic system has completely failed.
Yes, the democratic system has failed for really quite a long time. A lot of our checks and balances have been removed effectively. And as you say, that these councils and our own governments, they seem to believe that they lord it over us. They should be public servants, and they should be treated as such, and they should recognise that they should serve the public, not implement ideologies, which is what's happening at all layers of government. In the UK, we've got all sorts of problems with government in that we have far too much of it. You can start off with the United Nations. They've got splinter groups such as the World Health Organization, which we hadn't necessarily even heard of 3 or 4 years ago. Then you've got the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. Then beneath that, you've got the European Union. It's debatable whether we've actually left the European Union at all, because we've certainly signed a couple of treaties with them. A withdrawal agreement which doesn't withdraw from anything, and then a further agreement called PESCO, which is to do with armed forces. Then, of course, you've got 650 people in Parliament. You've got the Welsh and Scottish national assemblies beneath that. Then you've got various layers of council, parish councils, town councils, county councils. Then we've got thousands of NGOs and quangos. We've got a giant civil service that nobody's prepared to touch. And some of that civil service, the NHS is a very good example, that has been allowed to get wildly out of control in terms of its spending, and nobody's questioning its spending. So we have so much government lording it over us that the private individual really is struggling to make any way forward.
What you're describing seems to be a massive disconnect between the ordinary person and the institutions above us. And I think we've seen that certainly highlighted during COVID worldwide.
Absolutely. And if I was to send an email to my local MP, which I've done, the sort of emails that I receive back, he does not believe he's a public servant. He believes he's there to lord it all over us and implement any sort of globalist socialist agenda, even though he's a Tory. And that's the reason that I'm prepared to stand against him, and not necessarily win, but certainly take enough votes away to get him out.
Well, David, you seem to forget that those officials above us, they know better. You're just simply David Carpin. What would you know?
Well, I know that I should have inalienable rights. I know, for instance, I wasn't put on God's earth to consume an unlimited number of Pfizer vaccines, as an example. The moral of the story is that I should be free to walk outside my front door, to breathe the air, to take a dog for a walk, to enjoy nature, without being constrained in any way and told where I can go and where I can't go. Interesting enough, we're talking about travel, and if you look at the inside of the British passport, it says that you should be allowed to travel without let nor hindrance, and you would travel by the authority of Her Majesty the Queen, which now, of course, is His Majesty the King. So you can see that historically we had these inalienable rights, so why should we lose them now? And if we can travel cross-border, why can't we travel within our own city?
Completely. You touched on the politics, and I said your handle reformparty.uk. Tell us why you then personally have got involved with Reform Party, why you've chosen to go through the process of standing. Tell us about kind of that for you personally.
So I started taking politics more seriously, let's say 6 or 7 years ago, and I'd already come to the conclusion that the main parties, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, and the Conservative Party, the Conservatives certainly weren't conservative anymore, and the outcomes were always the same. It really didn't matter which party you had in Parliament. Yes, you got a bit more woke nonsense from the Labour Party, but apart from that, the outcomes really were all always the same. And when I studied this, I noticed that the Tories had been members of the Bilderberg Group since 1965, the Labour Party and Lib Dems since 1985. These are think tanks. But even to this day, all political parties attend them and come back with some of the same conclusions. You look then at the history of the Tory party from 1965, and in the early mid-60s, there was a two-horse race between Ted Heath and Enoch Powell. And of course, Ted Heath became Prime Minister as a compliant Bilderberger, and Enoch Powell didn't after his 1968 speech, I would imagine.
It sounds like Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak run all over again. Same thing.
That's right. So even Liz Truss, you see, she was Prime Minister for 6 weeks, but she had a job to do, and her job was to sign that PESCO agreement, which aligns us even further into the European Union. We're supposed to have left. Now, again, the good news, we understand our history, because unlike 1963 and the JFK assassination, and those documents had never been released, we know, because of the 25-year rule, what happened in the 1970s and how we got into the European Economic Community. And with all of that effort to get us in, were they likely to let us leave easily? And of course, we had 3 or 4 years of enormous battle through the media. There were, in fact, 4 votes. There was a referendum, there was the local elections, the European elections, there's a general election, and all of them said the same thing: we want to leave the European Union. So the only way that the Tories had of obfuscating this was to, rather than to repeal the European Communities Act, which would just got us straight out, they decided to go, rather than use our own constitution, to use the European Union's constitution, trigger Article 50, eventually sign a treaty called a withdrawal agreement. Well, if you talk to the Northern Irish and you talk to the fishermen, then there's been absolutely no withdrawal whatsoever. And then further to that, of course, Liz Truss has signed us into PESCO, which means our Army, Navy, Air Force, MI5, MI6, nuclear deterrent is all under the control of the European Union. So we're actually now more in the European Union today than we were in 2016, just without the MEPs.
No, and it seems into that you have Reform being a fresh voice. Obviously, came out of UKIP, was the Brexit party, and then has rebranded as Reform. But it does seem to be the kind of one kid on the block that's talking common sense on these issues.
And polling at about 9 or 10% as well. So a lot of the disenfranchised Tories, who perhaps are conservative, but have recognised that their party certainly isn't, are coming across to Reform now, and who knows, maybe some of the MPs will as well. But Reform will field 650 candidates, and I believe we have even more than that. So there's another 100 or 200 on top of that that could stand. So we will challenge every single seat across the country and take as many votes away from the Tories as we possibly can.
If you're a conservative voter, I can't see how you can realistically vote for the Conservative Party. And to put it in context with any US viewers, the Conservative Party are basically your rhinos over stateside if you're watching there. But I mean, I can't anytime. I mean, I voted Conservative at different times. I voted UKIP a number of times, but actually, for the first time, I'm thinking actually there's actually I could not. It doesn't matter what the makeup of my constituency was. There's no way I could bring myself to vote for Conservative. And I think many Conservative voters will be in that same boat coming up to whenever the next general election is.
I think part of that problem is the speed of movement. So historically, when a lot of the sort of left-wing ideas are pumped through the media, the people who are left-wing already just shoot straight over to as far left as you can possibly go. But the movement from the right is much, much slower. It moves to the left, but it moves slowly. But I think what we saw with the lockdowns and with COVID, that the rate of change is so great now, and with these climate lockdowns as well in Oxford, a lot of people weren't just from Oxford that were leafleting over the weekend. They weren't just from the UK, people from Ireland, all sorts of places, and all sorts of people getting together, making sure that within the space of a couple of hours, every single house received a leaflet, that they understood what these climate lockdowns are all about.
Tell us more about that, because I would have loved to have been there, and sadly I couldn't. I talked to a number of people from Together Declaration and from Reform, and I wanted to be there. But that seems to have galvanized, I hope it's not too little too late, but galvanized individuals from different organizations and politically, I think, from Reform. But tell us what happened on the Saturday.
So everyone was invited to meet up into a car park and pick up some leaflets and to deliver them. So it's very, very similar to a political campaign where you just want to leaflet an entire area. So we needed about 500 people. We got that. So people then picked up the area map. So it gave them a number of streets, picked up their leaflets, picked up a T-shirt, and then off they went. They made their way to that part of Oxford to deliver those leaflets. It was very well organised. We got a bit of media coverage as well. Not, of course, not from mainstream media, but we got some media coverage too.
And it brought, I mean, I think the Freds were there as well.
They were, yes. Right Said Fred were there, handing out the T-shirts. Great people they are too.
But I love that, the way an issue which is so destructive and which has been used as a test bed, that you pull in, you've got musicians, you've got campaign groups like Together Declaration, you've got individuals who maybe this would not be the first thing they would be involved in, but they see the danger. And to me, that alliances always are exciting whenever they come together, because you realize that actually the public are beginning to wake up and get it.
Yeah, they can see the scope creep. If it works in Oxford, that it will be extended within Oxford itself. So you'll have reduced travel until eventually you'll have no car at all. And then outside of Oxford, it's going to hit them too. And of course, this isn't even just a question for cities and towns. Once the cities and towns are done, what happens to everywhere else? And as I say, Birmingham, Canterbury, Oxford in the UK, Melbourne, Australia, other side of the world, Paris on the European mainland is coming to you very, very soon, unless you do something about it.
Well, so, what's the pushback in Oxford? Because I know in London, from watching the rollout of ULEZ, which is ultra low emission zones, which are, if your car is a certain age, then you have to pay 15-20 pounds to drive in, and the expectation is that everyone buys a new Tesla, which is of course above the vast majority of people's. I certainly couldn't afford to buy any electric car, never mind charge it from my flat, my 6-story flat. But it's this push, and it is the elites, those in government. They think actually just go and buy a new car, 30, 40, 50,000. That's small change to some people, and that's money that would be very hard work to earn for most of the public. But I think you've got this massive disconnect with those in authority and the vast majority of people who simply will feel they're being punished by anything like this?
Again, it comes back to scope creep, doesn't it? The concept of an electric vehicle is not a new concept. I mean, I can remember milk floats from the 1970s, and in fact, I think they date back to the 1930s, or even before that. So we're not talking about new technology here. What we're talking about is more expensive technology. And even when you go back to the old petrol vehicles and diesel vehicles, you ask yourself the question, well, why do I need a seatbelt? Why do I need airbags? Why do I need this, that, the other? Now, you're told, well, it's for your safety. But the reality is, a lot of this European legislation in particular would legislate to put these extra bells and whistles on vehicles in order to push the price up. So really, in a sort of a libertarian society, you should have the choice. You should have the choice of the type of car, the amount of equipment that you want on the car. You know, if you want to run round in a very bog standard sort of Fiat 600 micro car, why should it cost more than £5,000? So what's in fact happening here is that the price of everything is being pushed up. If you look at the economics of the situation, if a country has, let's say, no growth, zero growth and zero inflation, in principle, the money in your pocket doesn't change, but it does change fractionally in that technology will improve. So in fact, you will be able to buy a little bit more. So therefore, the globalists are artificially inflating the price of things, whether it be oil, gas and power, whether it be the price of vehicles, the move from one type of vehicle to another, until eventually nobody will be able to afford this stuff.
No, exactly. And the danger is with electric cars is that in a moment, at a flick of a switch, you can suddenly be paying a surge amount, so you can be paying extra. So it is absolute control of the populace that someone can just press a button and immediately that energy, that cost to fill up your tank could be 20, 30, 40% increased.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we saw during the pandemic with the price of petrol at the pumps, it hit £2. And there are only two prices for petrol. One is the price of oil, and that is set by OPEC, which is a corporatist cartel. There's no competition there, so it's not a capitalist idea. And the second thing in the UK is 45% tax. So the price of oil could be brought down in two ways. And similarly, with the price that we're paying for things such as gas right now. I mean, you question the so-called war in Ukraine. What would you really do? Would you suggest to everybody that they hoist a Ukrainian flag, or would you send your best politicians over there to negotiate with them and say, well, how about a ceasefire and let's get the world economy moving again? And in my lifetime, there's been very little negotiation on wars, almost as if many of them are contrived.
No, completely. And what you touched on with the cost, with the tax, I mean, again, people outside, it is a European issue that our energy is taxed so highly. And then the government try and blame OPEC, try and blame Russia. I mean, how could you blame Russia for your high energy costs whenever you have such a high rate of tax on it? But again, it's this move towards a higher and higher tax economy that simply punishes those who try and work and businesses and try and make a living. It seems to be a deterrent to actually trying to have a business and make a living.
Yeah, it does seem, going back to the question of immigration and emigration, in fact.
Yeah.
So with a million people coming into the country, and particularly people coming across on boats, then the taxpayer has to fund their hotels, because of course we haven't actually built any infrastructure for people to come in. We haven't built the housing, for instance, in 30 years. But of course, with the tax that people pay, which is up to 45% income tax, plus national insurance, which is another form of income tax, plus VAT at 20% on everything that you buy, plus import duties, plus fuel duties, plus cigarette duties, whatever you like. I mean, taxation is absolutely everywhere. And of course, to make ends meet, there will be few alternatives but to actually leave the country for those who wish to work. I mean, I was looking at Bulgaria, of all places, little old Bulgaria on the other side of Europe, where you will struggle to pay corporation tax or income tax anywhere near 15%, 15%. There's very little in the way of death duties. Their debt to GDP is 20%. Our debt to GDP is 100%, and I think it's about 135% in the States. I mean, these are bankruptcy levels. Even the United Nations says at 77 to 80%, that is about as much as any country can really afford in terms of servicing its own debt. So we, in the UK, United States, Japan is at 250%. A lot of these economies are just going to go at some point.
No, completely collapse. And you talked about tax, and it's a moving away from tax to fund the state towards using tax to punish and shoehorn people into a certain way. And that's a completely different use of tax from what it was intended, which is to run a country and provide some of the services which everyone needs access to.
Yeah, so most things, when we set out on a journey, whether it be tax, whether it be the NHS, whether it be the education system, they're all set up with very good intentions. Unfortunately, if I look at my tax bill, I can't say I get any return on investment. There simply is nothing. The NHS doesn't work, it doesn't function, you cannot see a doctor. And there are policies that Reform have that will assist with that so that people can see doctors. But similarly with their education system, I mean, it's sort of more Marxist propaganda than a true education, isn't it? So you look at the roads and the potholes in the roads. So money seems to be given away to these supranational governments. So the IPCC, I think we pay something like 25 billion a year for the climate change agenda. We pay, or we certainly used to pay 14 billion a year to the European Union. We still pay the European Union some monies, 14 billion a year for foreign aid. And then we have people that are living below the poverty line.
Just to finish off with looking at Oxford, you and Reform Party will be standing candidates in a general election, but also there is the local election side and local politics, and this is an issue, although is pushed by national government, is implemented by local government, and Reform will be part of that pushback at the local level. So I mean, tell the viewers about that.
Yeah, so local elections coming up in May, so I think they'll start taking on names from March and April. The process is much easier than a general election. There is no cost involved for anybody that wanted to stand for Reform in terms of a local election. All you really need to do is get some paperwork signed and get 10 counter signatures from people in the local area. And you can stand even as a paper candidate without running any sort of campaign at all. And therefore, we would urge everybody to do that. If you disagree with what the local councils are doing, why not stand yourself?
Yeah, and can I repeat that? Because I remember whenever we were getting individuals for the local elections in 2019 for UKIP, and I, as campaign manager, remember having a huge map on my wall and trying to make sure we had the candidates. But it is a simple process, and anyone who has a concern of what is happening in your local area, you can put your name forward and you can run. There is no, like in a general election, there is a deposit to pay for standing.
Yes.
That's not the case local. So I just want to reiterate that is a very easy way for you to put yourself forward and to impact and change what is happening in your local area. But I guess all that information will be on the website. If people go to Reform Party UK, they can and sign up to the updates, then they can get all that information. Is that correct, David?
That's absolutely right, yes.
Okay.
Or contact your local branch.
Yeah,
and they will assist you in standing in any elections. They'll do all the paperwork, provide the paperwork for you. All you'll need to do is fill it out with the 10 signatures. That is it. If you want to run a campaign, that's different. Yes, you might need some money, but if you don't want to run a campaign, you just stand, put the paperwork forward, and let's try and get some of these left-wing ideologues out and get rid of this idea of 15-minute radius travel areas.
Because David, I know I've been in this situation, I'm sure you have, where you've gone to vote, and there has not been the party or candidates you want to vote for. And I think by the public, those who are supporting reform, who agree with what reform are doing, that actually standing for reform gives others the option of voting. So I think it's the right thing to do as a citizen, as a British citizen, to actually put yourself forward and do that. So no one should be in the position where they get to the voting booth and look and think, well, there's no one here. And I think it's important that there is a reform option on the ballot paper. And I'm sure you'd concur with that, David.
Yeah, absolutely. So Reform have the 650 in terms of the general election, but there's often spaces available when it comes to any level of local election. So it's a good opportunity to get involved in politics and a very good chance of winning seats.
Yeah, completely. David, thank you so much for coming along. We've certainly looked at what's been happening in Oxford with horror, and it's great to have someone on who is looking at what's happening and has an interest in the area. So thank you so much for your time and coming along and sharing your thoughts on what's happening in Oxford.
Thank you.
Not all, and encourage all our viewers and listeners to have a look at the website reformparty.uk. It's on the screen. It's also in the description. You can click on it and have a look at the website, have a look at the party. And if you have been disillusioned by politics, don't walk away. If it's many of us are interested in politics and are frustrated what's happening, do not walk away and be cut off, but actually look for alternatives. And I think what you'll see in the Reform Party website will be of interest to you. So do make sure and use that resource. I think on that, I'll wish our viewers a wonderful rest of your day, and our listeners, those listening on Podbean or any of the podcasting apps who listen on the go, thank you for joining us. As a pre-record, we can put this out on any podcasting app. So if you're downloading this and listening to it on your way to work, thank you so much for being part of the conversation with us. Do pass it on, and we look forward to seeing you for our next interview. So thank you so much.